Hello, welcome to the Awakening Report. I'm your host, Doug Hamp. Great to be with you again. We have been looking at a number of topics concerning the two houses, the two sticks, the 10 lost tribes on some of our other programs. And today we have a special guest, Steve Casteel, and he is looking at the question of the law. He has recently written a book called Absconded. Are we evading the moral or the legal consequences of God's law? So kind of a hard-hitting book because he is dealing with something that a lot of people don't really want to talk about. When it comes to the topic of the law, we hear that that's something that was done away with. It was nailed to the cross. That was for the Jews. That was during the age of law, the dispensation of law. But now we're under the dispensation of grace. Now we are free because Jesus freed us from that law. And yet, when we continue to read the entire Bible, we get this picture that says, wait a second, God is still concerned about how we act. He's still concerned about what we do. He's even concerned about how we think, because ultimately each one of those different areas is for our good. It's not only for his glory, but it's for our own good. And when we live according to the ways that he's taught us, it will be better for us, and of course, it will ultimately glorify him. So with us, Steve Casteel. Hey, Steve, how are you doing?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Oh, doing great. So glad to have you with us today. So you live in Houston. I guess, did you survive the 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 hurricanes? I guess that's a silly question. You obviously survived, but what's it been like down there?
Well, luckily, where I live, we were flooded completely around us. And when I say around us, I mean basically my street. The whole neighborhood around us was flooded, and our street, we got some flood waters up to about halfway up our yard, but no water inside. We were praying and just hoping that that we didn't have to deal with that. So, but there's some areas around us, a little bit north of us and definitely south of us that I mean they had up to 6 feet of water inside their house,
Oh, wow.
uh, and it was rough. If you go to my Facebook page, a couple months ago, during that time, I was just posting pictures as much as I could so people could see what was really going on.
Wow. It's a thesis that I have is that America has been seeing some judgment, not because of the particular individuals. And I want to be very careful how I state this, but we've had just this year here in America, we've had what, three massive hurricanes. We've had, of course, the Las Vegas shooting, and all kinds of things keep happening to our country. And we say, well, it's a loose cannon, it's a bad apple, it's just Mother Nature or something like this. But when we read the Word, God says that if you follow my ways, none of the diseases, the plagues that came upon Egypt will affect you. Now, people might say, well, that doesn't apply to us anymore because we're not Jewish and we're not living in Israel. But I think the principle is still true, and I believe that America is under judgment because we as a nation, not just this guy or that guy or the people that were killed or the peoples whose houses were burned. I don't talk about that because currently we have all kinds of fires happening in California. So just thing after thing has been happening. And again, I want to be very clear. I'm not blaming the particular individuals who have suffered these losses. I'm suggesting that we as a country, as a nation, we are all responsible. And I happen to think of the words of Daniel in chapter 9 of his book, where he is, a righteous guy. God even declares him to be a righteous guy. And yet he's there, he's confessing the sins of his people. And he says, we have sinned. To you is glory and righteousness, but to us is shame of face. He doesn't say, well, to my fathers, to my countrymen. He says, no, we. And so he includes himself in that. And I think that that is very key because we all live in this country. And of course, we live in the world, but specifically of America, we all live here. And when one thing happens to one part of the country, it's really a group effort. And I believe, and I believe that you do too, but as your book suggests, we have absconded the law. We have said we don't want the law. It doesn't apply to us. It's for a different time. And yet now you've written this book that's saying, no, wait, hold on a second. It doesn't go that way. It doesn't work that way. So kind of give us a rundown of how you got into this book. What motivated you to write your book?
Well, before I do that, you said something about judging the nation, and I definitely agree. I actually saw what you put on Facebook the other day, and I shared it because everything you said was exactly, I agree with it. So I had to share it so everybody that I know would see it too. And we are at least claim to be a Christian nation, and I think that you're right, and God will judge His people, and I think He's going to judge His people first, and this is just kind of uh, the beginnings of that. But for this book, this is my third book. My first book, I talked about the beginnings and different gods that were named in the Bible, and people worshiping them, worshiping them, and different things. The second book was more so the end times prophecy stuff. Um, so actually, when I was doing the second book, I have a chapter about the elect, and I had to do some studying to figure out who that was. And it was kind of that chapter that spun off into this whole book about the law. Because if we are the elected in the tribulation saints, then that law is still applies to us because that law was given to Israel. Israel's God's people, and we're God's people, and I don't believe that we're replacing anybody. As the church is not, we're not replacing Israel as God's people now. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's what the Bible talks about. So if that's the case, then the only people we can be, according to Romans also, is we are drafted into the family of Israel. And if we're in Israel, we have to do what God wants Israel to do.
Yeah, and that's an important point, that we're grafted in, because I think sometimes when people hear that kind of language, they say, oh, you're trying to replace Israel. And I think both of us would say, no, we're not replacing Israel. We're not. We believe that they are real. They're, and when we talk about Israel, we're talking about the 12 tribes, okay, or the two houses that came out of this united kingdom of Israel, of which 10 were in the north, 2 were in the south. And we're talking about the entirety of Israel. And we have been grafted into that. We have not replaced the Jews. We don't supersede them or kick them out of their heritage at all. But we've been brought into that greater commonwealth of Israel. So I just wanted to say that because I think that's a huge point, and I think it takes a lot of times to hear it, to read it, until finally one day that light bulb goes on and you're like, oh, I get what you're getting at, and it took me a long time to understand that concept. But when I did, all these other pieces fell into place, because I wrote a book, I wrote as a paper. It was called Why God Did Not Elect Calvinists. I did a PowerPoint as well. And in there, I came to the conclusion that the elect are the Jews, okay? And I was partly correct, okay? I was, a lot correct, because God chose this nation of Israel. But what I didn't understand back then, even though it was so simple, is that the Jews are not the sum total of Israel. When we talk about the United Kingdom of Israel, we're talking about 12 tribes. But when we talk about the Jews, we're talking about really 2 tribes. We're talking about Judah and Benjamin, which became part of that southern kingdom, and of course some Levites, so maybe 2.5. But when we talk about Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, also called Ephraim sometimes, that was 10 tribes. They were divorced, sent away, and that's of course a very interesting story. And then it's the restoration of those two, bringing these 2 sticks back together, that represents the commonwealth of Israel. And just finally getting that eureka moment was a real watershed for me, so that I could put all these other things together to understand who the Jews are, who I am, how I fit in, how we Christians fit in, how it all comes together. And what you're doing with this book is you're saying, well, wait a second, if this is who we are, and God gave his laws to Israel, then that would mean that there's something for us to do. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with everything you just said. And, I grew up going to church, just your regular Methodist, Baptist, and Lutheran. I kind of went to all of them and never got this message. Never would have been able to take this away. Uh, but listening to you, Rob Skiba, Jim Staley, when I first really started studying the Bible on my own, I got the message as far as like when I read the Bible, I need to really study and read the Bible, um, and that's what I've been trying to do is take everything in the New Testament and find it in the Old Testament. That was one of the things that I was really trying to focus on with this book, is because just about everything Paul says is quoted from the Old Testament somewhere, somehow. And when you know that, you have to take the context from what it was originally written in order to really understand what Paul's even saying. Uh, and that's not what's happening in church today. When preachers are saying, "Oh, we don't need to follow the law's done away with." Well, my question has always been, well, since I've been doing studying for myself, what laws exactly are the problem? And then you get the stuff that preachers will say, because I try to talk to preachers all the time, much as possible, because I figure if anybody's going to know the Bible, it's going to be the people who are supposed to be teaching it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer
Good
that I
theory.
get, right?
Yeah,
The
good
answer
theory.
that I get is, it's either, well, I haven't really did a good study on the law itself. But then I'm like, well, why are you preaching against it if you don't even know what it is? And then the other one is they'll come up with, well, we don't need to, sacrifice, you know, in the temple anymore. I'm like, well, no kidding. There's no temple to sacrifice in, and aside from that, it's the high priests are the ones who sacrifice for the sins. It's not the common man. We take our sacrifice to them, and they do it for us. So that was never a responsibility of me anyway. So, the conclusion that I've come to is when you really break down the law and what it says for the common man, common woman, we do almost all that stuff anyway. The stuff we don't do is keep the Sabbath, keep the feast days, um, and the dietary law. Those are the three things that seem to be the biggest problem with the church, because everything else it seems like they agree that we shouldn't do or should be
Isn't
doing,
that
whatever.
interesting? I think that's a great point, because it's not that your average Christian, your zealous, on fire Christian, is not keeping most of the laws. They're keeping most of it. Obviously, as you said, the things that the priests would do, we could never do, of course. But yeah, it comes down to those three, which is really interesting. And Satan must have, in my opinion, Satan has something in there. There's something about those three that if he can keep the majority from doing, it's not that they're going to hell, but there's some loss of blessing as I see it.
Mhm.
So what do you make of those three?
Well, the Sabbath is God's holy day. That's His special day that He gave to us. The feasts are God's special days, special feasts that He gave to us. And then the laws, the dietary laws, are um, they're special for mankind, because if you don't eat right, you run into basically, like you said in that post the other day, cancerous issues, just health issues from not eating correctly. So, He's taken away two things that God wants that are special for us, and the third one directly impacts our health. And I think that He's killing us, and He's breaking God's heart by making us deny the special things that God wants for us.
Yeah, it's interesting. Unfortunately, it's a touchy subject for a lot of people. So, all right, so let's get into your book, Absconded. This is a pretty bold book you have here, evading the legal ramifications of God's law. That's a pretty bold statement. I mean, just by the subtitle alone, you're suggesting that something is greatly amiss. So let's kind of just maybe take this, chapter by chapter. We can always have a few rabbit trails here, but we start with a new promise. What do you have there? What's all about the new promise, chapter 1?
So the new promise is basically the new covenant, right? And if you read what the new covenant is, it's you have the same law, and it's actually quite interesting. Let me see if I can find it here. The Hebrew says it's established on better promises. So it's the only real difference is promises, and then the only thing besides that is the new priest. And the Greek words used in the book of Hebrew, you have change. The Greek word for change. Let me just look that up because I want to get this right. But basically, the word change is used twice, and in one of them actually means to swap out, to alter, to be different. And when it says that, it's talking about Jesus. Yeshua is now the changed, the new high priest. And then you go down a little bit further, and it says it's necessary also for a change in the law.
Okay.
Well, that Greek word transfer. So it's the same law, it's just transferred from one high priest to another.
Okay.
And I thought that was quite interesting. I think I have it here. The two Greek words. The first one is metatithelemi. I'm sorry, I'm not.
Metathemenes, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that one is the one that, and that's the one that actually changed something to make it different.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, and of course it's a middle. So it's a middle or a reflexive. So the priesthood itself changed, right? That's what you're going with that. It's like when somebody, changes their clothes, they're changing themselves. It's a reflexive or a middle use there. Okay. And then the other one is metathesis. So like a metathesis, right? We have that, of course, in English, where metathesis is where you're changing position of different things. Okay. In fact, we talk about this in linguistics, where you have a metathesis of different letters, where you might have two consonants or two vowels that just kind of swap places from one word to the next. The same meaning, but they've just changed places. And so that's a very interesting position. So interesting idea there. Okay. Right. So, okay. So what? So what does this actually mean for us? How do we understand that?
Well, I just think that because the author of Hebrews is using the word change, using two different words for the word change, in my opinion, that means there's two different purposes.
Okay.
And the first one, it seems like it's definitely to change, to swap out, to make different.
Okay.
And that's where we're talking about the high priest, and that's 7:11.
7:12. Yep. Yeah.
7:12.
Yeah. And let me just kind of support you here. Looking at the BDAG, this is the BDAG Greek English lexicon. That's the Art and Gingrich with two more guys that joined the club. But anyway, this particular metathemenes, it means removal of another place, taking up or taking away. That's the first definition. The second definition is a change or a transformation. So there was a change or a transformation. It's kind of like when you see a restaurant and it says under new ownership, right? Under new management. So, it's the same great pizza, right? But now there's a new manager in charge, so you can expect things to be better. That's kind of the implied message right there.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. Definitely agree. Now, I don't. I'm not super uh, good with changing, different words in Greek, but I do like to go to the Greek or the Hebrew to find out the meanings of those words, because sometimes the word used in the King James doesn't actually fit the definition, and and then also because we have different meanings for the word change. Those are things that I need to know. As a reader, as a someone who studies the Bible, I need to know what the words mean, because that's how you are supposed to build your doctrine. Is words mean things, and you need to know what was the intended purposes of those words. So,
Right.
with the new
Yeah.
promise, it seems like it's the same. And not only that, when you go back to Ezekiel, the new covenant, uh, I think it's Ezekiel, it's written, God's law is written on our heart. So it's the same law.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's what we're told.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's Ezekiel 36 you're thinking of, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I mean, it's such an important point here because God wants his law, his Torah, his instructions to be in our heart. I like to think of it like your driver's education. You get that driver's ed manual and it's a book sitting in your hand. Just having the book and reading it a time or two generally is not sufficient, right? Because if you do that, if you only have a very cursory knowledge of this manual and you carry it everywhere you go and you say, this is great, well, it's not going to help you drive, right? You cannot be driving and reading the manual at the same time. That's an actual violation of the manual, right? So the only way to have that manual in your heart is to memorize it by heart, just like we'd say in English, is to put it into your heart, to know it by heart, so that it's no longer an external document to your life. It's now an internal living part of you. So it's really part of your DNA. So that nowadays when you drive, you can do it without thinking. You can do it and be talking on the phone because it's so ingrained as to what you're supposed to do. You can do it and it really becomes second nature. And, that is really what the whole thing about the Torah is getting at. And I believe that's, of course, what you're trying to get at in your book. Just before we leave the Hebrews 7:12, when I read your book, I thought you made a really good point based on that passage there, that the priesthood being changed or it's being transformed, of necessity, there's also a change of the law. And again, the word here is transformation. So we could translate it two ways: removal, or a change, or a transformation, a transference, something different. So because the priesthood was changed, it's not that the priesthood has been done away with, right? I think that's an important point. That the priesthood has not been done away with. It's simply changed hands so that now Jesus is fulfilling all the offices of the priesthood, of course, especially the high priesthood, right? Um, so it's not done away with, but it's been transformed in a sense that now Jesus is doing it. But the very law that, Jesus still has to do those things that were required under the law for the priests, with one big difference, is that he's no longer required to do those on a daily basis because his blood is so supercharged that one drop of it one time is sufficient to fulfill, to satisfy all of the requirements that the blood was used to do. Now his one drop of blood, or whatever quantity it takes, is sufficient for all of those different things. It's kind of like when you had, now I remember back in the day, remember when we had phones and we had cameras, right? But we don't need phones and cameras now because one thing will do it all. And now with our cell phones, we don't need a flashlight, a phone, and a camera. We just need a phone, right? Because the phone has a flashlight built into it. It has a magnifying glass built into it. I mean, all these different things, of course, with apps. But that one device can do all these great features, whereas before we needed lots of different things. And nowadays, now with this new covenant built on better promises by a better high priest, his blood trumps everything, and you just need that blood, and it does everything. Whereas before, it took a continual refresher on a daily basis.
Definitely agree
Yeah.
with that.
So okay, you've picked our interest here with this idea of absconded law, the new covenant built on better promises. It's going to be the same law that would be put into our hearts. No, why do you think people have trouble with this? I mean, it's right in the New Testament, right, that we have the same laws, that God says He'll make a new covenant, but He's going to put His laws in their mind and write them on His hearts, which is, of course, a direct quote from Jeremiah 31:31. But why do people have so much trouble with this?
I think there's a couple different reasons. Number one, I think people don't really read the Bible to study it. I think they read the Bible to feel good. I'm saved. It's all about me. And I don't think that's the way it's supposed to be. It's not the individual. It's God. We're supposed to read the Bible to build a relationship with the Father. And to do that, I think we need to not just use the New Testament, because I think that's another part of it. Is a lot of people want to stay only in the New Testament, and not only a lot of preachers, want to stay in the New Testament. And I say that because whenever I have a discussion with a pastor or preacher, everything is always being quoted from the New Testament. Everything, when I'm asking specific questions to try to get an understanding of where they're coming from, they'll give me passages from the New Testament. And, and I can almost always bring up the idea like, hey, that is actually quoted from the Old Testament, and send them the passage there. And it's always like, they just brush it off, like, oh yeah, but that's not. We're talking about today, and that hurts because it's quoted for a reason. It's quoted because there was a purpose that it was written in the first place, and Paul was absolutely brilliant. He was chosen because he knew the Old Testament better than anybody, probably better than anybody in the world, and he was chosen because he had to take that knowledge of the Old Testament and bring it to the lost sheep of Israel, who knew the scriptures. I mean, maybe they weren't brushed up on, but they knew the scriptures enough to know that they weren't allowed to come back. And he had to take that message and bring them the good news that now they can come back. And
Hold on, that's a huge thing you just said. Say that again. The lost sheep of Israel knew they couldn't come back. At least some of them did. And now there's a message that they can come back. That's something that's completely unheard of in your average gospel message. So where are you going with that?
Okay, so with the divorce of the northern kingdom of Israel, because we know that the Israel split into two, north and south. The south was never divorced due to the promise that God made to David.
Okay.
That they could not be divorced. But the north, after they were split, they were divorced and scattered. The lost sheep scattered among the nations. When you get to the New Testament, you continually read about the stranger being scattered. Jesus himself says, I come only for the lost sheep of Israel. With the Jews, knowing the scriptures, they know that the northern kingdom cannot come back because they've been divorced. And once a woman is divorced from her husband, according to God's own law, He's not allowed to ever take her back. Whether he wants
Right.
to take her back, whether she wants to come back, doesn't matter. Can't come back.
Okay. Right.
So,
And where's that found? That's in Deuteronomy, right?
yeah, Deuteronomy
24, is that right?
24.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so just for our listeners so that they know that that's in the Bible, Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 through 4. Check that out. It's a huge part of the story. Again, Steve, are people talking about this? Are your average pastors talking about this divorce thing?
I've never heard it true. I've been in Houston for about 8 years now, 9 years now, and we've been to a couple different churches trying to find somewhere that we can go, and worship with other people. Now, I do believe Saturday is the Sabbath, and I think that's a good day to take off and rest and study for yourself. But I'm not against going to church on Sunday. I think that's fine to go worship on Sunday. I have a problem with going to church on Sunday and listening to the preacher talk, listening to him say everything is perfect as the Bible says, and then follow it up with something that's completely contradictory. For example, come Monday night, we're going to have a guys' night out and have as much bacon as you can eat. That just drives me nuts because you just said something that was great, and then you turn around and say something that completely contradicts the Bible, and that kills me. But as far as this message goes, no. Like I said, I've been to a few different churches here. Still haven't found somewhere that I feel comfortable going according to the messages. And everywhere we went, there's never, ever been a message about the lost sheep, about the divorce of the Northern Kingdom. And,
Wow.
that it's sad. It's really sad.
Is it that important though? I mean, some people would say, well, who cares? It doesn't really matter. People are living a good life, they love Jesus, so who cares? I mean, big deal.
Now, I think it does matter. I think it's a huge deal because if Jesus says he only came for the lost sheep of Israel, then he didn't come for, just anybody. He came for somebody specific. Now, I do think that there's a very high possibility that pretty much all of us could have, uh, blood be descendants from one of the lost sheep. I do feel that way. I don't think
Hmm.
everybody is, but I do think that it's very possible that people who do buy into the idea that Christ died for us, they're very likely descendants somehow, some way. I think it's probably part of God's plan to make sure He brings all the people back.
Hmm.
But the reason I think it's a big deal is because if we know who we are, we're more likely to pay attention to what God has to say to us.
Okay, makes sense. Right.
Right. And I think that's what God wants from us. I think He wants us to know who we are. I think He
Right.
wants us to just cry out to Him and say, "Hey, look, we get it. We understand. We are your people, and we understand you divorced us because we broke your law. We didn't, we thought it was, you know, we didn't think it was high and worthy of our time. But we get it now. We're back. We want to follow your law. We're going to do what you want us to do. And we understand that your ways are better than our ways. And we have faith that you want the best for us. And in your word, in our following your word, will benefit us as well as make you happy."
Hmm. Good points. Good points. So, what is it that you hear most often from? Well, let's deal with a very particular passage, Colossians chapter 2. This is a passage where it says in no uncertain terms, at least that's how it's taught. It says that and you being dead in your trespasses, the uncircumcision of your flesh, he is made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he's taken out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. So let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substances of Christ. Let no one cheat you of your reward, taking delight in false humility, worship angels, intruding into those things which he has not seen, vainly puffed up in his fleshly mind, etc. And so, I mean, what I suppose you probably get a lot of, from people is that saying, "Look, Steve, you're trying to put us back under law. Don't you realize that this is absolutely forbidden? I mean, you can even go to hell for trying to put people back under law. You're trying to steal our liberty, and your book is an affront to me. Your book is contrary to everything that many pastors are teaching. So how do you deal with that?"
Well, honestly, I really hope in the book I cover everything, everybody's questions, as well as really trying to do. But as far as that passage goes, I mean, we have to take it for what it says as far as uh, who was being spoken to. It wasn't uh, it wasn't just anybody. We're talking to Christians who uh, they're newly converted, and they still live in these other countries, and their friends and family, and probably their old preachers or whoever it was. They are still looking at them like, why are you doing this weird stuff? We're over here doing this. We're having fun. This is the way we've always done it, and now you're doing this new stuff, celebrating these new feasts, not eating the stuff that we eat. We're having ham for Easter. What are you doing? Why are you not partaking in our celebration? This is what we've always done.
So are you saying the first thing
And
to understand is to realize who the Colossians were? They were not formerly Jews, they were formerly pagans. Is that what you're
pagan.
saying? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
That is it.
Okay.
They're not. They weren't going around preaching the Bible. I can tell you that. They weren't preaching the Torah and telling people what to do. And Paul came and said, "We're not doing that anymore." But I've also heard, well, what about the Jews who went in there and talked to them and were trying to get them to, do these other things, for salvation? Because that's another big thing is that I hear is that you have the Pharisees coming along saying, well, you have to do this to be saved. Well, that's true. They were coming telling you how to do certain things to be saved. But the problem there is none of that stuff was ever for salvation. So either side of the argument, whether you're talking pagans are trying to get these guys, the new Christians, to go back to their old ways, or you have the Jews coming in trying to get the new Christians to do things in order to be saved. Both are wrong. Neither one of them are biblical.
Okay. So what
And
was it that was actually nailed to the cross? Because I know you have a chapter on that very topic. What was specifically nailed to the cross?
uh, so what I believe is nailed to the cross is you have the punishment for breaking God's law. So the God's law does three things. Number one, it tells us what sin is. All right, so it defines sin for us. So when we read His law, we know what we're supposed to do, what we're not supposed to do, according to Him. Number two, it brings blessings. When we keep His law, follow it, do what He says, He blesses us. It's good stuff. And then it brings curses. That's number three. Is if you do not follow His law, you are cursed. So what's nailed to the cross, in my opinion, is the curses from not keeping His law, which is why when we're not keeping His law all the time, we're not held accountable for that as far as salvation. Now, at the same time, I don't think that the law was ever meant for salvation, but I do think that was part of what was nailed to the cross is the curses for not keeping His law. The second part I think was nailed to the cross was the sins that Israel committed in order to be divorced. Because they obviously went out and completely disregarded God's feelings, God's law, everything, and warred with the nation. So that's a lot of sin that they, have built up on their shoulders that Jesus was able to wipe away. Is their sins for breaking His laws causing themselves to be divorced and scattered.
And
That was nailed to the cross.
what were those things that they did? Those adulterous things that they did for which God divorced them? Was it like lying and stealing occasionally, or was it something else?
I definitely think it was a little more than that. I feel that God probably doesn't like when we tell lies, but at the same time, I don't think telling a woman that she doesn't look fat when she might actually look fat is gonna that's not making. I don't think that's gonna make the list. What I think that Israel was doing, what they were doing according to the Bible was they were sacrificing their children. You have babies and you're killing them because this other god wants you to do that. So that was a form of worshiping another god. So that was one of the biggest things is killing your babies, which is really really sad considering
Well,
they
because
were
God calls
killing.
them an adulterer, right? He calls Israel an adulterous wife. An
Mhm.
adulterer is somebody who goes after another person outside of the relationship, right? So
Right.
is this what you're saying, that Israel was going after these other gods, which then did then require them to murder their children and to have sexual promiscuity and all of those other things, but it was going after those false gods? Is that the idea?
Yeah, definitely. So basically, your first four commandments is what they were breaking. Putting other gods in front of God, taking His name in vain, basically belittling His name like He doesn't mean that much, breaking the Sabbath, doing the things that directly show that they do not love God. Because that's why I think Ten Commandments, first four are showing how we love God. The last six are how we love our neighbor. And they were doing those things. Definitely putting Baal and Molech in front of Yahweh and doing the things that they require instead of doing the things that God wants
Hmm.
to do.
Okay.
And throughout the Bible, throughout the Old Testament, anytime you are worshiping another God, that's considered adultery, considered whoring with the other gods.
Right. Right. So another thing that you bring up in your book is sin and death, the law of sin and death. That's, of course, something that a phrase that Paul uses, that we've been freed from the law of sin and death. We often hear pastors and such talk about this phrase in reference to the very laws of God themselves. You're taking a different stance on that. What are you saying about that?
Well, Paul actually talks about a ton of different laws, and I think like seven or eight of them. And the law of sin and death goes back to Adam. Before Adam sinned, there was no death. When Adam sinned, it brought death on mankind. So from that point on, whenever man sinned, they were guaranteed to die, right? Um, so when that kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, being nailed to the cross, the curses of breaking God's law. So if we are now, you know, under the law of Christ, then we are no longer under the law of sin and death. So when we sin, we have an advocate. We have Yeshua there to catch us with grace. So I mean, we're men. We're human. We will mess up. We will sin. The Bible shows that even David, a man after God's own heart, sinned. I mean, he went out and uh, had some woman's husband killed that he wanted to have be his wife. So, even David sinned, and so we do mess up. So that being said, with the law of sin and death, I think that part was also nailed to the cross because we no longer have to curse. It's one of the curses
Okay.
that we no longer have to deal with.
Right. So it wasn't the Torah, it wasn't God's instructions, his commandments to us that were nailed to the cross, but it was actually that principle, that law of sin and death that was introduced by Adam at the creation. That's what was nailed to the cross. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's definitely what I
Okay.
believe.
Okay. Very cool. So So what would you like people to walk away with from your book? I mean, you've written a good book. You've brought a lot of interesting evidence. Not everyone's going to believe it, but if you could really get through to somebody, what is the core message that you want them to say, oh, okay, I maybe I should see things differently than how I used to see it. What is that one thing there?
You know, what I really want from anybody who reads this book, I want them to just read it with an open mind, to not be set in your ways when you read it, to give yourself a chance to understand. And when they read it, I want you to walk away with the idea that I don't have to listen to the preacher because he's the preacher. I can go into the Bible and study it for myself and be able to take away a deeper meaning than what I get, every day or every Sunday at church. There's so much more to the Bible than what we hear. It's not all about me, it's all about God. I mean, that's kind of what I would like is to understand who we are
Mm-hmm.
and understand that we don't need somebody else to tell us what to believe.
Okay.
Um, just basically understand our identity, understand that uh, the word is we need to be studying for ourselves and just to open people's mind up enough to go and do that. Whether they believe me or not, at least take the book, go back and study the Bible as much as you can on your own and come away with the understanding that God wants you to have.
Okay. That's good. When will your book be available for people to pick up? When do you think?
I'm really hoping it'll be the beginning of November.
Okay.
I'm doing a little bit of editing stuff right now, so I'm hoping I'll be all the way done with that around the beginning of November.
Okay. And where can they get it once it's out?
Amazon will be the best place to get it. Just go in and type in the name with my name, and it should pop up.
Awesome. Okay. Well, everyone, this is Steve Casteel. He's been sharing with us about his new book, Absconded: Evading the Legal Ramifications of God's Law. That's a hard hitter. Steve, I appreciate the great work that you've done in the book. I think that you were courageous to take on some of these topics. And, I think the bottom line is that we have to understand that God is the one who gave us his commandments. These are not something that the devil put out there. If you listen to some of the preaching out there, you might think that it was the devil who gave those laws back there at Mount Sinai, but it was God himself. And in fact, if you understand that no one has seen the Father at any time, then it certainly highly suggests that the one that was seen by Moses on top of Mount Sinai was Yeshua himself. If that's the case, then Yeshua is the one that people that Moses got to see to some extent, that was going with them in the wilderness. That seems to be the language that we hear. I mean, that it was Yeshua. And if it was Yeshua who was there with them speaking out these words, then those are his words. They're not just the Father's words, but they're Jesus' very words that he got directly from the Father, and he communicates these to the nation of Israel. And it's not just his second best, his third best, or here's a little something to tide you over until we finally get to the age of grace, but he's giving his very best. He's giving that which is perfect. And if something is perfect, you cannot improve upon it by very definition. Otherwise, it's not perfect. All right. So now we use these words so flippantly. We say, oh, that's perfect. But then, the next model of whatever comes out, we're like, well, that's even better. Well, that means that the previous one wasn't perfect, right? I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. But when God says, hey, this is perfect, and people say, your word, your law is perfect, then it means it is perfect. It cannot be improved upon. It will never be taken away because it's perfect. You can't give something better than perfect. So it was Yeshua who gave us the Torah. And when Yeshua came to earth, it's so cool. It says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word, God's Word, Yeshua, the very embodiment of the instructions, that instruction, it turned into flesh. That's what's so incredible. It turned into flesh, and then we got to see that Torah, that Word, lived out. We got to see what it actually looked like to live those principles perfectly, completely, flawlessly in this life. Even with great temptation, Jesus was able to live it out. And now, because we've seen him do it, he says, a new commandment I give to you, to love one another as I, the living word, the living Torah, the living, breathing Torah, have loved you. Because this is what it looks like to do it. So I encourage you to get Steve's book, Absconded. It will challenge you. It will help you. It will cause you to see things in a new light. And of course, that's what we want to do, because none of us have arrived. We always have more to learn. And so we want to thank you, Steve, for blessing us with your good work. And everyone, check it out. And until then, stay in the Word, because God's Word is the answer to our troubles in this world. So we thank him for all that he's done. And of course, we thank you, Steve, for being on and joining us today. God bless everyone.